All right, welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Foley. In this seminar, we're going to be doing a live training on the book 7 Dates with Jesus, Crossing Over into Abundant Life. Now, if we want to build an abundant life, something I've learned is we have to build a balanced life. Now, a lot of times when we think about life balance, we think about balancing work and family and money and these types of areas. But what I've learned is there's a much higher level of balance that you must get in place first if you want to have a successfully balanced life. First area is your spiritual life. We have to be balanced in spiritual life. Then we have to have be doing a good job in our mindset and emotions. And then we need the practical skill sets. Now, what I want you to think about is that all of this flows from the inside out. When we get the spiritual part right, it's a natural overflow into your mindset and emotions. When we get the mindset and emotions right, it changes the way you show up in the practical areas of life because you're working with peace and with joy and with faith and with love. And it changes the way that you do things from the inside out. So the spiritual part creates the foundation. So we have a program called the Abundant Life Blueprint. And 7 Dates with Jesus is the spiritual training part of this. It's going to accelerate your spiritual growth. We're going to talk about how to get connected with God better, how to find your purpose, how to understand God's timing. God has patterns that he uses, how to understand God's ways and his timing. These are some of the things we're going to be talking about in this training on 7 Dates with Jesus. Now, my story, I had no spiritual life whatsoever. I was way out of balance. I was running my personal training business, and things were not going the way that I wanted them to go. When I first started the business doubled every year for the first couple of years, but then I started to hire staff, and we started to run into issues. And as the business got to a certain level, it's like I was stuck at a ceiling, and I could not seem to break through, and the business eventually started losing money. I'm dealing with staff turnover and all kinds of problems. And I just remember walking around the neighborhood with my wife one day and just saying, you know what, there's got to be a better way to live. There's got to be a better way to do life, because I was stressed out all the time. I'm working all the time. I'm working, getting up at 5 in the morning, going to work, and working until 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night, working all day long. I don't have a life really other than work. And I was just like, there's got to be more to life than this. Then one day I had a business partner, and he had a book on his desk called The Richest Man That Ever Lived. And it was a book about Solomon. And King Solomon, if you're not familiar with him in the Bible, was the son of David, and he was given supernatural wisdom from God. And in this book on King Solomon, he says, if you will read one chapter from the book of Proverbs every day for 5 years, it will change your life. Well, that time I needed a better way. I needed something different in my life. And so I set out on this challenge to take this Proverbs challenge. Now, the way you do it is this. Proverbs has 31 chapters in it. They're short. They're like a half a page. It doesn't take long to do. It takes 5 or 10 minutes to do. And on day 1 of the month, you read Proverbs chapter 1. Day 2 of the month, you read Proverbs chapter 2. And you keep going like that to the end of the month. If it's a shorter month, you just read 2 Proverbs on the last day of the month, whatever it may be, and you start back over the next month. Well, I started to do this, and I'll be honest, when I first started, it was a struggle. We had a young baby at the time, and a lot of times I'd have to go into the bathroom just to get some peace and quiet to be able to read these things. And I struggled with them for a while, but about the 11-month mark, something happened. I began to see that the things that I was reading in Proverbs were true. What I quickly noticed when I began to read Proverbs is the way that I was thinking and the way that God thinks were much different. My thinking was not in line at all with the way that God thinks. And so Proverbs began to renew my mind. It began to grow me spiritually. And at about the 11-month mark, something began to click, something began to change. I remember I was sitting, we were on a vacation visiting my parents, and I remember it was right around Thanksgiving time. I remember getting up and being excited to actually read the Proverbs for the day. So if it takes you some time to get into them and get into the rhythm of them, that's okay. I kind of had to discipline myself to do it for a while, but eventually I got into a rhythm of doing it. I've been doing it for something like, 7, 8 years now. I have not missed a day in something like 7 or 8 years of doing this, and it's just become part of my daily schedule. Now, when I first started reading Proverbs, this verse, Proverbs 13:22, says that a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And I started to think, what's more valuable than money that I could pass on to my kids or grandkids one day? And the answer was wisdom. What if I could pass on to them? What if I found this better way to live and I could pass on to them lessons. And I started thinking about, what if I could pass on lessons for health and fitness, which I already had some expertise in? What if I could pass on lessons for, business or finance or family or spiritual life now, things like that. And it started me on this journey of starting to write books. So the reason I wrote this book, 7 Days with Jesus, is actually to pass on the lessons that God has shown me about growing spiritually, to pass them on to my kids and my grandkids one day. And then as I began to talk to people about it, it's like, you know what? A lot of other people could benefit from learning these lessons as well. So I started to build programs out to help take people through these same lessons. Now, so let's talk about the feasts. 7 Days with Jesus is based around the 7 feasts of Israel. Now, you may have heard of them. It's things like Passover and unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets or Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And when I'm going through my Proverbs, and I'm at about the 11th month mark, and I came across this guy. His name was Bernardo Lapallo. At the time when I came across him, he was something like 113 years old. And at that time, I had been traveling all over the country. I was working as a personal trainer. I had been traveling all over the country, and I've been spending about 6 weeks every year traveling all over the country, studying with the best health and fitness experts that I could find. And I'm traveling, I'm learning, I'm studying, I'm trying stuff out on myself and on clients. And I'm getting more and more confused because nobody agrees on anything. Some people say to do a lot of cardio. Some people say to lift weights. Some people say eat a plant-based diet. Some people say eat a low-carb diet. And I'm getting more and more confused because none of these experts seem to agree. And I come across this guy, and I came across another lady who was 106 and had been on her deathbed in her 30s and had healed herself with nutrition. And both of them said the same thing, that, hey, all of our secrets are in the Bible. The 113-year-old man said he had never been sick a day in his life. He looked like he was 70. And he's still thriving. He says, hey, all of my secrets are in the Bible. The 106-year-old lady says, hey, everything I'm doing comes out of the Bible. So I said, you know what? I've been reading the Proverbs every day. I probably need to read the rest of the book. So I started at the front, and I read it like a book. I read it front to back like a normal book, and I got so much out of it for health and fitness and nutrition and these types of things that I started over and I read it again. Now, what also happened, even more important what happened, is I began to develop a relationship with God. I began to pray. I began to study my Bible. I began to kind of immerse myself in the Bible. Now, when I went through that first time through of reading the Bible front to back, I discovered the Feast of Israel. So in the Old Testament, you'll see that God gave the Jewish people 7 feast days, or they were called moeds. They were appointed times. They were like the holidays that they were to observe. So they had 3 holidays in the spring, which were Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits, which all happened within 1 week. Then you have the Day of Pentecost, which happens in the early summer. And then there were 3 fall feasts that happened in the fall. There were the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles that all happened within about a 2 to 3 week period. So you have 3 feasts that are all kind of grouped together in the spring, one that's by itself in the early summer, and then you have another 3 feasts that are all grouped together in the fall. So I came across these feasts, and at the time, I didn't know much about Old Testament, New Testament, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, living by grace versus law, these types of things. I didn't know much about that. I'm a newbie at this point. So I prayed and I asked God. I said, God, I'm developing my relationship with God at that point. I'm seeing how much God loves me, and we're getting closer and closer. I said, God, I don't know if these feast days, what's the deal with these feast days? I don't know if they're important. Are they still relevant to us? These are in the Old Testament. Are they still relevant to us at all? If so, would you just make it clear to me? Would you give me a sign that these feast days are important? And so as I did that, so here's a chart on the 7 feasts. So you got Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. Those 3 all happen in about a 1 week period in the spring. We have the Feast of Pentecost, which happens in the early summer, usually in the end of May or early June. Then we have the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. All happen in the fall, usually in the end of September or in October. And then there was something called the Year of Jubilee, which we'll talk about later, that happened every 50th year, which was like a year of rest. It was a year of resetting of the economy in Israel. Now, at that time, when I said that prayer, I said, God, would you just make it clear to me? Would you give me a sign if these feast days are important? Would you just show me? So I started Googling the next feast coming up, which was the Feast of Trumpets. And it was actually pretty close. We were pretty close to the Feast of Trumpets. And so when I began to research the Feast of Trumpets, here's what I found. It's like New Year's Day in the Jewish culture. And they have a tradition where they eat apples with honey on that day to symbolize that it's going to be a sweet new year. You're going to find that on the Jewish holidays, there's a lot of symbolism of things. And we'll talk about the importance of that here in a minute. But they would eat apples with honey on that day to symbolize a sweet new year. Now, I didn't know much about the feast, but I said, you know what? If we do it from our hearts in honor of God, that's not going to hurt anything. So I said, that could be a good thing to do. It sounds delicious anyway. We'll have some apples with honey with my one daughter, Anya, at the time, and my wife, Trisha. We'll have some apples with honey that night. Well, all the feasts happened at night. So think about it. This is like a New Year's party, basically, a New Year's Eve party. You'd have it at the nighttime. And so on that morning, I woke up. I was like, we don't have any honey. I made a note that I need to go to the store that day to pick up some honey for that evening. But when I got to the gym that morning, my very first client walks in with a great big jar of honey. And to my recollection, that's the only jar of honey I've ever been given at the gym ever before. People have given me a lot of other stuff through the years, but that's the only time I've ever had a jar of honey. I said, all right, God, I get the picture. You're trying to show me that these feast days are important. So we had apples with honey that night. Now, what I also began to see when I studied this Feast of Trumpets, it's also called Rosh Hashanah, is that it starts a 10-day period called the 10 Days of Awe. The 10 Days of Awe is from the Feast of Trumpets, the next 10 days. The 10th day ends on the next feast, which I'm going to go back a slide. The 10th day, we're on the Feast of Trumpets here. The 10th day ends on the Day of Atonement. So the 10th day of the 10 Days of Awe is the Day of Atonement. Now, in the Jewish culture, the Day of Atonement is considered the most holy day of the year. In the Old Testament, it was the one day when the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies and make atonement for the sins for the people for the entire year. So it was a big emphasis in this 10 days of awe on repentance and making sure everything is right, everything is clean by the time we get to the day of repentance, because that was the day that was considered the most holy day of the year. And the tradition said that that was the day when God decides how your next year is going to go. And so I saw this 10 days of awe, and I began to do a couple things. God began to give me the revelation that in the book of Daniel, Daniel does a 10-day Daniel fast. Now, I had always had a connection with Daniel. I'd actually been named after him. My parents were going to name me Luke, but I almost died when I was born. There was complications in my birth, and I almost died, and my parents changed my name to Daniel at the last minute because it was like I came out of the lion's den. So I've always had this connection with Daniel, and God began to show me the reason why Daniel did a 10-day Daniel fast, and you see this in Daniel, I think it's Daniel chapter 1. He did a 10-day Daniel fast. Daniel fast, you eat only basically anything that can be grown from a seed, so fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, that kind of thing, and you drink only water. He did a 10-day Daniel fast. The reason he did 10 days is because this was the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and the Day of Atonement. This is not in the Bible. It's something that God showed me. This is why he did the Daniel fast for those 10 days, because he wanted to be clean for the Day of Atonement. So I began to do a 10-day Daniel fast during this time. And I also put a big emphasis on repentance. I began to reconcile some relationships. I had some people that I needed to call and reconcile some relationships. And there was one person in particular that I knew I needed to call, and I waited all the way to day 9. It took some courage. What I've learned about this is if you will take the action to reconcile and to forgive, because that's what God has commanded us to do. He's done that for us, and he's commanded us to do that for other people. So part of the revelation of the Feast of Trumpets is we're supposed to be getting things right. We're supposed to be taking action on things. We'll talk more about this idea later. But I waited all the way to day 9. I had one person in particular that I knew I needed to call and to reconcile with. And I waited all the way to day 9. I actually never did get a hold of them, but I did make the call on day 9. And from my side, I did everything that I could do to get right. I had some people that I owed money to. I paid bills. I did everything I could do to get right, both financially, reconciling with people, getting relationships right, forgiving. And I did this Daniel fast at the same time. So it was 10 days of getting a lot of stuff done, getting right for the Day of Atonement. Now, leading up to the Day of Atonement, like I said, the Day of Atonement was considered the most holy day of the year, and it is a day when in the Jewish culture where they do a complete fast. They do a complete fast. And we'll talk more about the revelations of Jesus hidden in these two feasts as we get further into the seminar. But it was the one day of the year when the priest could go in and make atonement for the people. And they do a fast. The Bible tells them to afflict themselves on that day. So I said, you know what? They fast so the Day of Atonement is the 10th day of those 10 days of all. So I did 9 days of the Daniel fast. And then the 10th day from 6 p.m. the evening before to 6 p.m. that next day is a total fast. No food, no water, no nothing. And so, just as a funny story, the Day of Atonement, I didn't tell my wife I was doing it. This is all new. I didn't tell my wife I was doing it at the time. And of course, that's the day she says, hey, let's go take the kids for ice cream. Let's go take the kids to Chick-fil-A and we'll go get ice cream. And then we go to a church picnic and there's pizza and handing out pizzas and all these types of things later. So there's a lot of temptation to eat. But about 9 a.m. that morning, it didn't take long, about 9 a.m., I'm sitting on the floor with my daughter Anya and we're playing. And all of a sudden, she starts pointing out, hey, look, there's a rainbow on the floor. The light was coming through our window, in our living room window, in such a way that there was rainbows all over the floor around us. It was creating these prisms, and there were rainbows all over the floor, all around us. And at the same time this is happening, she's like, look, there's a rainbow. Look, there's another rainbow. Look, there's another rainbow. At the same time this is happening, I start getting flooded with this revelation of the number 7, about how 7 times 7 is a complete cycle. In the Bible, you'll see that the Jewish people were told that they were to, every 7th year, to have a Sabbath year, where they took a complete year off. They did not plant their ground. They did not sow their fields, anything like that. A complete year off, let the ground rest for a year. Once they completed 7 cycles of that, the 50th year was called the year of Jubilee. So 7 cycles of 7 years was a complete cycle. I started to get all this revelation about how 7 times 7 is a complete cycle. And at the same time this is happening, there's rainbows all over the floor all around us. And keep in mind, a rainbow has 7 colors in the rainbow. Now, in all my traveling around the country, searching with these health and fitness experts, one of the things that I had begun to study was Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine. And in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, they put a big emphasis on the impact that color has on the body. So I had been already teaching for a number of years that, for example, blueberries are good for your kidneys and your bladder. Leafy green stuff is good for your liver and your gallbladder. Different foods have different impacts on your body based on the colors. These 2 concepts that came on the Day of Atonement, the rainbows and the 7 times 7, this whole book, 7 Days with Jesus, and my next book, Cracking Heaven's Code, these 2 concepts are the main concepts that initiated those 2 books. And they taught me a whole system for health based on these 2 concepts. Whole different way of looking at health, whole different way of looking at the body. Everything, these 2 concepts right here that came on the Day of Atonement were the 2 biggest pieces that I needed for many, many things. And I didn't know at the time. It took me years to unpack this now. This has been 7 years ago. And I'm still unpacking some of the things I learned from just the rainbows and the 7 times 7. One revelation from God, one key word from God can completely alter the direction of your life in a good way. One key word from God can completely alter the direction of your life. And a lot of times what I found is this: on the Day of Atonement, God often gives me some of the clearest messages I've ever heard from him have all come on the Day of Atonement. And we'll talk more about that as we get later into this training. So then, as all this is happening, my wife is pregnant with our second daughter, Kira. And I was thinking she was due any day. She was actually overdue. I was thinking she was actually going to be born on the Day of Atonement that day. But she wasn't. 2 days later, it was time. Trisha went into labor early that morning. 2 days later, it was on a Monday. Now, leading up to Kira's birth, when we went in for ultrasounds, there were some issues going on with Kira's kidneys on the ultrasounds. And so we had to go through genetic testing, genetic counseling, just in case she was born with a birth defect, because it looked like it was a high probability. And on the other side of it, when our first daughter, Anya, was born, Trisha was induced, and Anya came out really quickly and caused really bad tearing for Trisha. And Trisha had to be taken to the operating room right away to get sewed back up. And so Trisha was worried about the delivery for herself, and we're also worried about Kira. And I just remember we got together and we prayed, said, God, give us the birth the way, before the fall, birth wasn't supposed to be painful, these types of things. Give us the birth the way that you intended things to be. And I would say, God answered that prayer. Here's what happened. Keep in mind, this 2 days before, I've got this revelation of these rainbows. God has shown up to me in a way that I cannot deny. And I've got this revelation of the rainbows and the number 7 and all these types of things are going on. And we get to the hospital. I remember looking at my phone because I had to call the gym because I didn't know when Kira was coming. So I called him to let him know what was going on because I'm still working kind of off and on, just waiting for her to be born. I called him to let him know what was going on. It was about 8 a.m., almost exactly when we got to the hospital. And we get to the hospital and they say, well, your contractions are kind of slow right now. So why don't you start walking the halls of the birthing center and that will speed up your contractions. And so we started walking and we started walking. And every time we tried to sit down again, her contractions would slow. So we walked and we walked and we walked and we walked and we walked for 4 hours. We just walked and walked and walked and walked. And all the time, again, I'm talking with Trisha, but in the back of my mind, this concept of the rainbows, I'm trying to figure out what God's trying to show me. And a little bit before the 4 hours were up, our doctor comes in and he says, hey, I think we should break your water now. I think we should break your water. And by the way, I'm going to make you get an epidural because I'm going to slow down the delivery on purpose when we get to the end so that there's no tearing. I'm going to slow it down on purpose. I'm going to push the baby back in. Actually, I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm going to push it back in on purpose to make sure that there's no tearing. So exactly to the minute at 12 o'clock, exactly 4 hours, he breaks Trisha's water. And when that starts happening, I began to hear from God on the inside. And just like, I'm not saying I heard an audible voice, but just like God would talk to any of us on the inside. For those of you that have a spiritual life developed, you'll know when God is speaking to you sometimes. I just start to hear this message on the inside that water prepares the way. And pay attention to what I'm about to show you, the timing of the pattern I'm about to show you here. So we walk for 4 hours. He breaks her water at the 4 hour mark. Then she goes into pretty uncomfortable contractions at that point. She's having contractions that are, pretty uncomfortable at that point. She goes through 2 hours of contractions, and it takes a while for the doctor to come in to be able to get the epidural put in for whatever reason. So she goes through 2 hours of contractions, and exactly 2 hours later, they have the epidural finished being put in. And that's like a big relief because she was hurting pretty bad up to that point. So they get the epidural put in exactly 2 hours later. So we had 4 hours of walking, 2 hours of pretty uncomfortable contractions, and then it began the time to push. So after they got the epidural in, they said, hey, it's probably going to take a little while before things start to happen. And I pulled the nurse aside and said, hey, with our last daughter, Anya, when we got to this point, it actually happened pretty fast, so you might want to be ready. And pretty much right after they got the epidural in, 5 or 10 minutes later, Trisha's like, you need to go get somebody. So I'm looking around trying to find a nurse, trying to find somebody, and finally I get somebody to come in. They're like, whoa, it's time to go. It's time to push. We weren't expecting this already. So they come in, doctor comes in, and it's time to start pushing Kira out. And here's what they did. He would have Trisha push, and not to get too graphic, then he would actually push Kira back in, and he would stretch Trisha, and then she would push again, and they would push her back in, and they would stretch her, and this went on back and forth like this. And exactly 1 hour later, so it was at 2:57, 3 hours short of 1 hour. 1 hour later, Kira was born. Trisha had 0 tearing. Everything was perfect. Kira was perfectly healthy. No issues at all. And I asked Trisha, I said, I don't understand this last hour. So God began to show me this pattern. 4 hours of walking, 2 hours of contraction, 1 hour of pushing. What does that equal? That's 7 hours. I just been learning about the number 7 2 days before that. 7 hours. Here's a pattern hidden in the number 7. 4 plus 2 plus 1 equals 7. I asked Trisha, I said, I understand the walking. I understand the contractions. I don't understand the last phase. She said, I could describe that last hour in one word: pressure. I could describe the last hour in one word, which is pressure. We'll talk more about this pattern, but this is the pattern that's hidden in the number 7. So the Bible talks about that we are born again. We are being born again. What I believe God showed me was this is the pattern. This is the path that he takes us through to being born again. So you'll see 4 plus 2 plus 1. Here's what I've learned. Bible tells us in the book of Acts, they asked the disciples, hey, what do we do now? We believe. What do we do now? He says, repent, be baptized, be filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. This is the path that God's taking us through. Now, I also believe this. I began to seek God one time on, hey, does this path apply to the individual or does this apply on the corporate level to the whole church? And the answer I got was both. God doesn't change. This is the same pattern that he's taking the church through. And this is the same pattern that each of us as individuals go through to work out our redemption as we go through getting born again. This is the same pattern. I began to seek God. Why this pattern? What's the deal with this pattern? He said, if you reversed it, what's happening? Here, the numbers are doubling. God's into doubling things and multiplying. 1 leads to 2, leads to 4. What would be the next number in the sequence? The next number would be 8. Why 8? 8 is the number for new beginnings in the Bible. 8 is the number for Jesus in the Bible. I've actually got a new book that's coming out very soon called The Eighth Date. It's going to be a sequel to this book that's coming out very soon. This pattern leads us to Jesus, is what it leads us to, a new beginning with Jesus. Now, God wasn't done yet. We still had one more fall feast to go. So Kira's born. I'm pouring through my Bible. We're in the hospital for a couple days after Kira's born, and I'm pouring through my Bible trying to make sense of this pattern. And I began to see, like, hey, wait a minute. Whenever God's people were in the wilderness, it seemed to be always related to the number 40. It's one of the things that he just began to show me in those couple days when I'm in the hospital. When the Israelites cross over the Red Sea, they go into the wilderness. They're there for 40 years. When Jesus gets baptized, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days. I began to see, hey, wait a minute, there's a connection there. Same exact pattern. God's a God of patterns. Same exact pattern. The Bible tells us that when the Israelite people crossed the Red Sea, that was like their baptism. And so the next feast coming up was a few days later, is the 7-day feast of the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles is like a fall harvest festival. So you have the day, Feast of Trumpets, which is like the New Year's Day, which starts that 10 days of awe. You finish on the 10th day, which is the Day of Atonement. And then I believe it's something like 5 days later you wait, and then you start a 7-day or 1-week period called the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a 7-day harvest festival. And on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, I just kept hearing this on the inside. Go check the day you're baptized. Go check the day you're baptized. I just keep hearing that on the inside. And so I asked my wife, Trisha, I said, do you know where those certificates are from where we got baptized before? See, we had been baptized a few years before this, and my wife had found a church that she wanted to go to, and one of the things they wanted us to do to be members of the church was to get baptized there, because we hadn't been baptized before. And so I had gone along with her, and up at this point, I didn't really have any relationship with God at that point. I had gone with her just because it was the right thing to do, I guess. And so I had been questioning, did that even count? Do I need to get baptized again? And actually, one of our pastors said, I don't think you need to. None of us are where we need to be when we first get baptized. It's about what we do after it, how we grow after it. So I said, okay. So I kept hearing this. You need to go check the day you're baptized. So I asked my wife, Trisha, do you know where those certificates are from where we got baptized? And she said, you mean this one? And she actually had it in her hand when I asked. I said, yeah, why do you have that in your hand right now? That's really weird. She said, well, I was looking through, I'm making a new baby book for the new baby, Kira, that's just been born. And I had out our first daughter, Anya's baby book, just kind of reminiscing and going through her baby book at the same time. And we were baptized right around the time when Anya was born. And so the baptism certificates were in Anya's baby book, and she happened to be making a new baby book and just kind of reminiscing at that time. And she was holding up, hey, here's this baptism certificate. So I said, I take the baptism certificate. I'm like, all right, what am I looking at, God? He says, look at the date. So it was May 25th, 2010, when we were baptized. The date that day was September 25th, 2013. And I started doing some math. It had been exactly 40 months to the day since we've been baptized. And God was showing me, hey, your 40 months in the wilderness are over. And I started thinking, hey, wait a minute. After the wilderness comes the promised land. We're going to the promised land. But what I did not realize is God has a process he's got to take you through before you can enter into your promised land and really possess it and to take it. So let's talk about God's big picture pattern here. This is the process that God took the people of Israel through to get them to their promised land. They're in Egypt. They're in slavery. They're in bondage. They cry out to God. God sends the 10 plagues, the last one being Passover. They get delivered out of Egypt on Passover. And it says, I was just reading in my Bible yesterday, it says that on the day after Passover, the Israelite people marched triumphantly out of Egypt as the Egyptians were burying their dead. They marched triumphantly out of Egypt. They cross over the Red Sea, even though Pharaoh and the Egyptians chase after them. They cross over into the wilderness. And when they're in the wilderness, God has them send spies into the promised land to go spy it out, to go check it out. Remember, Jesus got baptized 40 days, Israelites 40 years. For me, 40 months. I wish I had done a little faster. God has them send spies into the promised land to go check out what he has for them. They come back with a report saying, it really is the promised land. It's the land of milk and honey. They carry back a pole with grapes on it that are huge. Say it's amazing land, but we have a problem. There are giants in the land, and we look like grasshoppers compared to them, and they will crush us if we try to go in there. Then all of the leaders, all of the people start moaning and complaining and grumbling to God and to Moses. Why would you bring us out here into this wilderness just to bring us into a land where you're going to kill us? Why would you do this to us? But two guys, Joshua and Caleb, respond differently. They respond with, hey, God is with us. He's given us this land. Let's go take it. If God's with us, we can take it. So here's what I've learned about this wilderness time. During this wilderness time, what happens is this. God is going to give you a glimpse of where your life could go, of his plan for your life, where he wants to see your life go. And it's better than anything you could ever think of. It really is the promised land. Better than anything you could ever think of or dream of or imagine. But it looks impossible. And it's very easy to disqualify yourself because it doesn't look possible or you don't think that you are capable of getting to that place. And here's the truth. You are not capable of getting to that place. But God is. So the wilderness is a place where you learn to trust God. You learn to put your trust in him and to follow his leading. You see, in the wilderness, God sends them manna. He gives them water from a rock. He gives them everything they need. It's a place where they're learning to trust God. But then when they come out of the wilderness, eventually, 40 years later, they have to cross another river. They have to cross the Jordan River. When they cross the Jordan River, it's different. God tells them, step into the water. The waters are at flood stage, it says. When they crossed the Red Sea, the waters parted, and then they walked through. This is different. God tells them, tell the priests to step into the river first, and then when they step in, then I'll part the waters. So in the wilderness, God is going to show us a glimpse of where he wants to take us. And how we respond will be the key as to whether we come out or not. Do we respond with faith and belief that nothing is impossible with God, that God is with me and he can help me take it because I can't take it on my own? Or do I respond with fear and doubt and unbelief and moaning and groaning and complaining and wanting to go back to the way things used to be? Because you see all the time in the wilderness, the Egyptian people say, hey, let's just pick a leader and go back to Egypt. We were better there. Let's go back to the way things used to be. So I found this in coaching a lot of people. A lot of people want to go back to the good old days, to the way things used to be. To enter into your promised land, you must become a forward-looking person who believes and has faith and trusts that with God, nothing is impossible. And you're willing to go after something bigger for your life. These are the keys to coming out, because nothing is impossible with God. So they take a step of faith. So crossing the Jordan River is being willing to take a step when you don't have all the details figured out. God's telling you to take the first step, but you don't have all the details figured out. Are you willing to take it? They cross over the Jordan River. And then when they cross over, God says, I'm not going to give you the land all at once. It's going to take more than a year to possess the land, because if I gave it to you too quickly, the beasts would be too many and you wouldn't be able to handle it. So what I've learned is this: there's a 1-year transition period. When you cross over, there's a 1-year transition period that happens before you can take the land. And during that 1-year period, what's happening is this: you're getting prepared. Think of it like you're stepping into a new job. You're stepping into a new role where you're partnering with God to take your promised land. Well, in the beginning, it's in the wilderness, it's about you proving that you trust God. Now it's proving that you are trustworthy in this next phase. It's learning to get yourself out of the way and allow God to flow through you, and to learn to live by faith in this 1-year transition period. It's in this 1-year transition period where these 7 feasts of Israel become very important, because hidden in each one of these feasts is a revelation of Jesus that's going to help you take that promised land. Hidden in each one of those feasts is a revelation of Jesus that's going to help you take your promised land. Each feast shows you a different angle of something that He has done for you. And when you put them all together and you stack them all one on top of another, it's a complete system, complete package for helping you take what God has prepared for you. This is not my idea. This is God's idea. He set it up this way. And then we enter into our promised land. So why the wilderness? Why does God do it this way? Why does He bring us into the wilderness? I want you to think about this. God says that we are all being born again like a seed. I want you to picture this. When a woman gets pregnant, she has a seed planted in her, and that seed has to grow. I want you to think of this. The wilderness is like a womb. How long is a woman pregnant for? Very interesting. 40 weeks. Fits our same exact pattern. Where is the safest place for the baby when the baby is first conceived? The safest place for the baby is in the womb. Once you get first baptized and you first believe in God, you accept Jesus into your heart, the safest place for you, once you get baptized, you go immediately into the wilderness. Jesus was driven immediately into the wilderness after He was baptized. Why? Because it's the safest place for you. It's the safest place. When a baby is in the womb, the mother does all the work. She feeds the baby. The baby doesn't have to do anything. The baby is protected, and the mother does everything for the baby. When the Israelites are in the wilderness, God sends them manna. God sends them water from a rock. It says that their sandals did not wear out for 40 years. That's some pretty good sandals that don't wear out for 40 years. God did everything for them. So it's like a baby in the womb. How do we emerge out of that wilderness? Like I said, it's proving that you trust God and you're willing to move forward rather than wanting to go back to the way things used to be. You've accepted Jesus into your heart. Are you going to go back to living the same way that you've always lived? Or are you going to step forward and move into a new life, into a new way of living? You've been born again into something new. The Bible tells us to put off the old man, to be renewed in our mind, and to walk in newness of life. So we got to learn to put off the old man. We got to renew our mind, and that 1-year transition period is a lot of mind renewal that's happening, and then walk in newness of life in the promised land. So we're proving that we trust God in this wilderness time. It's the safest place for you, actually. It's a gift. God only does good. He only gives you good gifts. People view the wilderness as a bad thing. The wilderness is a place of safety. God is protecting you in there. God is protecting you. Now, when we come out of that wilderness time, we go through this 1-year period. Why a 1-year period? Well, if you look in the book of Noah, or the story of Noah, and the book of Esther, story of Esther, you'll see in both of those stories there's a 1-year period. In the book of Noah, when the story of Noah, when it starts to rain, everybody knows it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But most people don't realize is Noah was on the ark for 1 year and 10 days. So God shut them into the ark for 1 year and 10 days. What was happening during that year? Well, they're about to have a new beginning. There's 8 people on the ark, the number of new beginnings. They're about to have a new beginning in the world where the world is starting over. God is preparing them for this new world that they're about to step into. It's a 1-year transition. God is preparing them. In the book of Esther, there was a queen in the land. She did not obey the king, so she gets kicked out as queen. They said, let's make a search for all the beautiful young virgins in the world, in the country. They bring them in, and they're going to pick one of them to be the new queen. But before any of them can be chosen as queen, they have to go through 1 year of beauty treatments. So there's a beautification process that has to happen first before we can step into what God has for us. Because God knows it will be too much for us. Again, this is a gift of time to prepare. There's one more biblical story that comes from the ancient Jewish wedding tradition. In the ancient Jewish wedding tradition, a bride and groom would get engaged. And at that time, it was a contractual thing. It's not like our engagement today. They would get engaged, and what would happen is this: the husband or the groom would leave, and he would go to his father's house. And while he's there, he is preparing a house for his bride. And the rule is that the house that he's preparing for her must be better than where she's coming from. Must be better. And he doesn't know when he's coming back. He's going to come back about a year later, but he doesn't know the day. He will only come back when his father tells him that it is time to go back and get his bride. Now, what is the bride's job during this time? Her job is to get ready for the wedding. Her job is to beautify herself and to prepare herself and to get ready for her new life, married to her husband and this new house that he's going to be bringing her to. Now, what did Jesus say? I'm leaving. He died, he's resurrected, and then he leaves and he goes back to heaven. What did he say? I'm leaving. I'm going to go prepare a house for you. I'm going to go build a mansion for you. I'm going to go prepare a place for you. And I don't know when I'm coming back. I only come back when my Father tells me that it's time for me to come back. And what is our job while he's gone? To beautify ourselves and to get ready and to learn how to function by allowing God's grace to flow through us. To kind of get ourselves out of the way so God can flow through us. This is what's happening in this 1 year period. So think of it this way. Another way to think of it is it's an onboarding period. It's an onboarding period where you are getting trained and you are getting prepared and you are getting ready for what God has for you in your life. It's a time where you must immerse yourself in his word, immerse yourself in his ways, and go through the training. And the training we're going to use is found in the 7 feasts of Israel. Each of the feasts has a key lesson that you need to learn before you can step into your promised land. Could you learn the lessons a different way? Sure. But the 7 feasts of Israel provide a nice framework for learning these lessons, and they also give you some key indicators to learn about God's timing. They give you some key indicators to learn about God's timing. Now, one of the things that's happening in that 1 year transition period is sanctification. It's during that 1 year period that you are set apart. You are becoming sanctified. Now, it's interesting. The Bible has a duality. It says you are already sanctified in Christ, but you're also working out your salvation. You're becoming sanctified as well at the same time. So it's already done. You're already set apart through the blood of Jesus for good works. You're already set apart for something that he's called you to. But it's during this 1 year period that we begin to go through that process of getting separated unto God, dedicated to him, and filled with the things of the Spirit of God. That's what's happening. You're going through a 1 year sanctification period to become ready for what he's got for you in your life. Now, like I said, these 7 feasts, so the next 7 days of training, we're going to go through each day we're going to go through one of the feasts, and we're going to go through the lessons in each of those feasts. Now, why the feasts? I'll be the first one to tell you this. The feasts are in the Old Testament. Jesus fulfilled the law for you. You don't have to keep them. You don't have to do any of them to be right with God. In fact, if you try to keep the feasts to be right with God or to earn favor or blessing with God, it might actually send you in the wrong direction. So make sure you're doing it from the right heart stance. You're doing it as a point of remembrance to remember something that Jesus did for you. Each of the feasts is going to teach you something about Jesus. It's going to give you a point of remembrance. Now, sometimes the feasts have symbolic things like you eat lamb or you eat unleavened bread or you eat apples with honey or whatever it may be. They have things that you actually physically do. Something I've learned, this is not in the 7 Days with Jesus book, I've learned this recently, is there's something called a point of contact. Oral Roberts wrote a little book called How to Find Your Point of Contact with God. And it's putting something physical that you do as a point of remembrance to express your faith, to put something physical with the spiritual. And it creates a point of contact that releases your faith out into the world and makes it effective. So each of these feasts, what do? They teach you lessons about Jesus. They are points of remembrance to remember what he's done. Now, could you be remembering these every day? Yes. But there is a yearly cycle of feasts to give you built-in reminders throughout the year, just in case you ever forget. Just in case you ever get off track, these yearly feasts can give you a nudge in the way of a point of remembrance. So wait a minute, I forgot. I have the Holy Spirit living on the inside of me, who's supposed to lead me into all truth, teach me everything I need to know, navigate my life. Oh yeah, I forgot that. I need to get back on track with that. The feasts are also a time to connect with God and get into a rhythm with him. What I've learned is there are some things you can only learn about God by getting into a rhythm with him. In the Old Testament in the Bible, the temple had a rhythm. There were things that needed to be done every day, both morning and evening, things that needed to be done every week on the Sabbath, things that needed to be done every month on the monthly new moon, and then these seven feasts that form a yearly cycle. So they allow you opportunities to connect with God and to get into a rhythm with him. Think about it this way. Most parents like to spend time with their kids on the holidays. Well, these are the kingdom of heaven's holidays. They're celebrating our hero, which is Jesus. Think about it. In the United States, we have 4th of July, we have Veterans Day. What are these? These are times of remembrance for things that have happened, to celebrate our independence, to celebrate our veterans. These holidays are set up to celebrate Jesus. They're all about him. They're set up to remember and to celebrate Jesus and to take moments to remember what he's done for you and to connect with God and spend time with God like kids on the holidays. Now, the other part of this is I was praying one time, and I don't know about you, but I was having a hard time keeping my life in order at some points. Got business, I got kids, I got family. How do I keep it all orderly and keep it moving forward and organized? And the answer I got was, God told me, look to the pattern of my Sabbaths. What are the pattern of my Sabbaths? There's daily, there's weekly, there's monthly, there's this yearly cycle of feasts. These are the Sabbaths. It's a whole system for creating order and momentum in your life. When you get on to this yearly cycle with God, it does, I don't know how to fully explain it with words. It does something where it puts you into a rhythm with God and it creates more order and structure in your life, and you build momentum every single year. It's like you're knocking out major projects. You'll see that in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul used the feast days as deadlines. Hey, I want to be to this point by the day of Pentecost. So I've actually used the feast days as deadlines for writing books and doing major projects and things like that. So this is the purpose of the feast. So the rest of the trainings, we're going to be taking time each day. We're going to be going through one of the feasts and talking about the lessons hidden in those feasts. Again, here's the feast chart. So Passover. So right now, as we're recording this, tomorrow we're going to do the training on Passover. And tomorrow night is actually Passover. Then the next day, we'll start 7 days of unleavened bread. The next day, we're going to do the training on unleavened bread. So literally the day we start unleavened bread is the day we're going to be teaching unleavened bread. The next day is the third day. That's when Jesus rose from the dead on the day of first fruits. That's what we typically think of as Easter. We're going to be teaching first fruits on that day. Then from the day of first fruits, the people were told to start counting days. And there's 50 days to the day of Pentecost. So think about this. Jesus rose from the dead. Then he comes back, and it said he appeared to the disciples over a period of 40 days. During that 40-day window, he's training them on the kingdom of heaven. Then they have the day of Pentecost, which is 50 days after the day he was resurrected. That starts usually in early June. Then we have a gap from Pentecost until about mid to late September, maybe early October, where the Feast of Trumpets starts. Then 10 days later, we have the Day of Atonement. And then a few days later, we start the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles. And then we have the Year of Jubilee that happens every 50th year that completes this cycle with of 7 times 7. So that's what we're going to be going over in the upcoming days. I look forward to hearing from you guys as we move forward.